Okay, so let's continue where we left off discussing chapter 11. So we left off talking about reproduction of protozoa. So some of these protozoa reproduce in different ways. As far as the list of asexual processes or the way they reproduce on their own, they are listed right here. Okay, and then we'll look at some images of those. So these can reproduce through fission. You guys might have heard more often binary fission. Uh, this is the most common type, but there are more types than binary fission. There's multiple fission as well. Bi means two, so binary fission means that you're starting with one adult protozoan organism, and it's essentially splitting into two uh, smaller protozoan organisms that eventually become adults themselves and reproduce in the same fashion. Okay, so the process of fission produces more individuals than other forms of reproduction, and binary fission would be when you have one individual splitting into two. So, kind of how some other single celled organisms or bacteria also use binary fission to reproduce. Budding is another form. It's called this because essentially what happens is that you have a small bud form on the adult organism, and that bud starts to grow and then pinch off and become an adult itself. So it says occurs when a small cell or a bud pinches off from the parent cell. So a bud grows on the parent, that bud pinches off and falls off of the parent, and then that bud grows up to be an adult organism itself. If we look at some of these, right here, you could see binary fission. So you could see these organisms, they're starting off as one adult organism and they're splitting into two. So here's trypanosomes, which we'll talk about these guys. These guys are protozoa that are very dangerous to you. Here's euglena, okay, which is a common photosynthetic organism, or protozoa, I should say. And here's a few other protozoa. Example of budding. Now you can't see a protozoa here. This is actually a hydra. This is an Idaria, which we'll talk about not next chapter, because next chapter is about sponges, but the chapter after that, because an Idaria is the same type of organism as like jellyfish. But if you look on here and you see this hydra, you'll see a small bud start to form. That bud starts to mature a bit. That bud pinches off and becomes a juvenile form of that organism, which eventually grows up to be an adult itself. As I mentioned, binary fission isn't the only type of fission. There's other types of fission, such as multiple fission. It's essentially the same as binary fission, except instead of the organism splitting into two, it splits into more than two. There's really not much to it besides that. It says many individuals formed simultaneously, not just two. Um, if the union of gametes precedes it, so sperm and egg, they call it sporogony. I want you to note that all of the above is accompanied by some form of mitosis. Obviously, that makes sense because, like, if you look at the budding, for example, or if you look at one adult splitting into two, they're going to be smaller than the original, right? So there needs to be some form of mitosis in order to build those cells up and make them larger again. It says mitosis in protozoa divisions varies from other mitosis. Oftentimes the nuclear membrane doesn't dissolve, it persists, and you don't use centrioles. If you guys remember the mitosis process, the centrioles and the spindle fibers, the nuclear membrane dissolving and the chromosomes coming out in chromatin, etc. Hopefully you remember that from biology. You did those a few years back, so you need a refresher. But if you had me for biology, you made booklets for mitosis. Maybe you remember that. Besides asexual, protozoa do reproduce sexually. Now it says that all protozoa reproduce asexually. There's some that exclusively reproduce asexually, or that's the only way they reproduce. All of them are able to reproduce asexually, but sexual reproduction also occurs widely among protozoa. Sexual reproduction is usually, well, it's not usually, it is better than asexual reproduction if it's possible. Asexual is nice because you could do it by yourself, but sexual reproduction occurs as well. And the reason that they do that is because you want to switch up your DNA and create more diversity so that your species has a better chance of surviving. this isn't important. This just talks about meiosis as far as it's about that. You guys have studied meiosis in biology before, so you already know what that process is. Okay, don't worry about this. Okay, so the last slides of this presentation talk about the different major protozoa taxa. Okay, so we'll do a whole assignment on this, and you guys will be familiar with some of these major taxa. So you can look at some of these notes to help you with that assignment. You don't really need to know specifics of these, but this talks about the different phyla that belong to protozoa, okay, and some of the different characteristics of them. So it talks about retortomanda, which these protozoa include commensal and parasitic protozoa. So ones that are in parasitic relationships where they benefit and the others suffer, or commensalistic ones where they benefit and the others unaffected. And it says that some of the key factors of these protozoa is that they don't have mitochondria and they don't have Golgi bodies. If you guys remember what those do from biology as far as cells go, right? So Golgi bodies are the packing centers, and mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Everyone remembers that. That's the one thing that you remember from biology, if nothing else. So anything else that I've referenced on here, if you didn't remember, you definitely remember mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? You have diplomonads, which also lack mitochondria. An example that's on here that's a common one is Giardia. Looks like this. Okay. You find this in dirty water. This guy, if you ingest dirty water and you drink it, he can cause diarrhea. You have Euglenozoa, which, like I mentioned, Euglena before is an organism. That was that green photosynthetic one that was on the previous slides. Um, Here's that term monophyletic from last chapter. Okay. These have a specific organelle called the pellicle, which is the cell membrane is stiffened into that, so it's kind of a protective barrier for it. There's a subphylum of these as well, but Euglenozoa are pretty cool because these are photosynthetic protozoa. You have Quintoplasta, which it has information on that here. Okay, one important grouping in these is Trypanozoa. We'll study two of the trypanosomes and some of the organisms that carry them. These are very, very dangerous. So these protozoa are parasites, and these protozoa can be deadly, and they can actually kill humans. You have Cilophoria, which you might derive from the name. These are ciliates, so these all contain cilia. They're larger than most protozoa. They're free living, okay, which means that they don't necessarily live inside of other organisms. They can live on their own outside of other organisms. There's a lot of protozoa that only exist inside of organisms because they're parasitic usually. But a lot of these are free living and can live on their own. This would be like Paramecium, be an example. Yeah, they all contain cilia, as I mentioned. Okay. Oh, I'm going back up. I was gonna wonder. I was gonna say there's 3 slides in Ciliphoria. I didn't think there were. Okay. We talked about this already. But yeah, when we talk about parasitic protozoa, the ones that live inside of your body, those are referred to as endoparasites. Endo mean inside, parasitic means that they gain while you suffer. So endoparasites are living inside your body. Okay, last slide. So another protozoa that you guys are kind of familiar with maybe is Plasmodium. And maybe you're like, well, I've never heard of that before. But Plasmodium is referred to as the malarial organism. So you guys might know that mosquitoes cause malaria, but the reason they do is because mosquitoes carry a protozoa called Plasmodium. So Plasmodium is actually the thing that causes malaria, but it's carried by female mosquitoes. Okay, so this is an important protozoa to study because of the infectious disease. It says there's 4 species of Plasmodium that infect humans. And the way that it works is that Plasmodium can be present in the female mosquito's saliva. So if a female mosquito that's carrying Plasmodium, for lack of a better term, bites you or injects you, Plasmodium could be carried in her saliva and she can inject you with Plasmodium, and that's how you can get malaria. Now, the thing is, and the good news is, at least for us living in North America, is that Plasmodium really only survives well in humid tropical environments, which is why malaria is very common in areas in South America and jungles more so than it is up here. And that's why malaria is an issue there and with those mosquitoes, but not so much the mosquitoes that we deal with up here in North America. So, in case you guys have ever wondered about that, that's the reason. Okay. All right. I'm going to talk more about specific protozoa and specifically protozoa parasites in a different lecture. But for now, we've covered chapter 11 between this one and the last lecture. So you guys have time to work on um, your chapter 11 questions that go along with this. Okay. Hopefully you learned some stuff. Have a good day.